Good afternoon and welcome to the webinar on the power of telling your story. This webinar is meant to help you with your presentation skills, your public speaking skills, any situation where you stand before an audience or you sit before an audience and you have to convey information. And after the webinar, I hope that you'll be encouraged and realise the power of using story in conveying your message, if not all of your message, certainly some of your message. So my aim would be that each of you move away or walk away at the end of the webinar with some ideas and some tips and some thoughts around how you could use story the next time you're before a group of people. So that is my aim from today's webinar. A little bit about myself. I'm a public speaking trainer and coach, and I have an absolute passion in helping people find their voice, find the confidence, find the ability to get their message across. I believe that everyone has got something to say, something to contribute, has ideas and valuable information that they should share with their organisation, their communities, wherever. So my passion is helping people confidently and effectively get that message across. You're probably all aware that public speaking is frequently put forward as the number one fear within the human race, with dying being number two. So people have got things to say, but they don't always have the confidence and the ability to get that message across. And you sometimes see people with the gift of the gab, the ability to speak, exceed their expectations or move ahead while other people seem to be held back because of their fear of public speaking. What to do during the webinar, how to make best use, is to take notes as you go at any stage. I'll pause periodically for questions, but also at any stage, please ask questions. Two ways you can ask questions. You can type directly into the question dialog box, or you can raise your hand and I can open up your microphone and you can ask a question then. Also, feel free to follow up with any additional questions after the webinar. You'll see on my first slide, and you know my email address and my website. You would have had to go through that to get to register for the webinar. So please, after the webinar, still feel free to email me and make contact. What are we going to cover today? And it looks like there's a lot of material, but a lot of this I can touch on really quickly, and a lot of it is interwoven and interrelated. So I'm going to cover why tell stories. Why not just deliver your information, your facts, the data, the reasoning, a good scientific point of view, and then leave it at that. The need to create emotion, which to some extent answers the first question, and how to make your story unfold. It's not just about being a storyteller unless you're reading to children, for example. The power of sharing your struggle, why and how your stories are your unique intellectual property, how to frame your stories for different audiences, how to choose different aspects of your story, different parts that gel or match a particular audience's needs and will have greater impact. That's called framing, or how to frame your stories. I'm going to encourage you to build a bank of stories. So you might have one story, and the last point is about your signatory story. That story you can always go back on, but it's good to have a bank of stories because your audience is not always the same, and you'll need to bring in different stories for different audiences. So that's the agenda in the hour that I have got with you. And yes, I've just had a question typed in. So by telling stories, I don't mean just tell stories to entertain. We're telling stories to convey information, to convey learning, to convey facts, and to persuade people to another way of thinking. So it's not storytelling just to entertain. There are those storytellers, and within Australia, the Aboriginal people are great storytellers, and their storytellers create emotion and they entertain, but also the storytelling within Aboriginal people is also to help pass on the law and the tradition and the history of their people, which they don't do in the written word all that often. Most of it's through storytelling. This is storytelling about having an impact, influencing and educating an audience. So thank you for that question. Why tell stories? Here's some information that I found. If you tell people some facts, some details, some information, there's about a 5 to 10% retention rate. So if you go back 2 days, a week later and test those people, assuming it's not you're not lecturing for an exam or something, so they've swatted up, but just they've attended a seminar, 5 to 10% will retain the information that you've given them. If you add visual images, and that can be your PowerPoint slides, that can be drawing on a whiteboard, flip charts, something you hand around, that increases the retention rate to 25 to 30% of the audience. However, if you tell a story, if you couch the information in a story and you give examples, and the examples in the story are engaging and they create an emotion within the audience, so the audience walks away remembering the emotion or remembering the feeling that your story created, then the retention rate increases to 65 to 75%. That's why tell stories. People will remember the information. If you tell a story, once again, and it's just a nice, good news story and there's no facts or no details or no call to action or no why, then people may remember the story, but they're not going to change. So it's more than just helping people retain. The story has to contain the information, the message, the new position that you want the people to take on board. So that's why we tell stories. Just to add to this a little bit, Benjamin Franklin said, "Tell me and I forget, teach me and I remember, involve me and I will learn." Involve your audience and you can inspire, persuade, educate and transport them with your story. Take them on that emotional journey within your story, and that will really help with their retention rate. And they'll learn. They will learn. That's what storytelling helps you to do. And the key to this really is the creating of emotion, the emotional journey. Taking people on a roller coaster ride is one way of describing it, but making them feel something around what you're telling, a need to move, an emotion that what's the status quo is not acceptable. This quote is from Aristotle, and it's not a quote, but Aristotle, one of the fathers of public speaking, suggested that all speakers must have pathos, and pathos is the Greek for passion. So it's the emotion and the passion with which you, the trainer, the presenter, the speaker, use. Good speakers learn to communicate with passion, emotion and energy as they're conveying their story. So the story helps you create that emotion which delivers the passion and helps increase the audience's retention rate. Another reason is that and it comes back to retention. People don't remember what you told them, but they'll remember how you make them feel. So the stories, as I've already said, so this is reiterating what I've said, the stories help create an emotional experience. The roller coaster, the need for change, the status quo is not acceptable. So rather than just bombard them with facts, next steps, data, the process, what we need to do, the information, the statistics, the how-to, those things, weave them into a real story, create them, create the emotional experience, and you'll get some retention around the information. They may not be able to recall exactly what the data was or what the statistics were or exactly what the steps were, but they'll have that feeling that this is possible or this needs to happen or this is not acceptable or I can see hope at the end of the tunnel. And that recollection will then enable them and empower them to take the next steps, which might go back to you and find out, so what were those steps that I need to go through to commence this journey? If you leave them with the steps and the facts and the data, and you don't leave them with that emotional feeling that they need to change, then nothing will happen. Cigarette advertising has changed over the years. There's been lots of facts and data over the year, and we know that cigarette smoking increases your chance of lung cancer, cardiac disease, diabetes, a range of other things. It's not good for you, but the facts have not, over time, reduced smoking rates. So they started to bring in some emotion into it. And we've heard people tell their stories, sad stories often, and that's helped bring down the smoking rate. So the story, the emotional experience will add to the retention, and then people are more likely to adopt and move forward in your way of thinking. So that is why. That is why tell stories. The next step becomes that's why tell stories and the need to create emotion. The next thing is, so how do you make your story unfold? How do you make your story unfold? The best stories do come from the heart, and you can make up a story. You can use anecdotes, but if your stories are from the heart, then they're more likely to stick. I'm just going to pause for questions for a moment. And please, any stage, type in the questions. Why is it that emotions, or the emotional journey, or the emotional story, why is it that that is something we remember? And I guess it's if you know, when you walk out of a movie, if it's a feel-good movie, or you walk out feeling something. So after you've heard a speaker present or speak, if you walk out with a feeling, you're more likely to do something as a result of that feeling, and that's what the emotional is about, I think. Okay, back on track. How to unfold your story. It's quite a simple 3-step process. First step is, so start with the challenge or the question, the problem, the what we need to do, the situation as it is. Productivity is down, absenteeism's up, smoking in teenagers is on the increase. Then share the struggle, share the emotional experience, share the steps in overcoming the problem, show people hope. Use stories, your own story if possible, other people's stories where they have been able to overcome the same challenge that most people in the audience are facing. Trying to do more with reduced budgets. at the moment. Use some innovative stories that other people have used to come through what's been a budgetary crisis, and then end with the resolution. How was it solved? What was the solution? Or what's your call to action? So that's the 3-step process that good storytelling takes. Start with the challenge. Share the struggle, the experience, the steps, and end with the resolution. What happened? What's the solution? What's your call to action? Within that framework and the stories and the emotions that really have impact, every story needs surprise, or what they call is a violation of expectations. So if you go back, you can sort of start with the problem, share the struggle, but the resolution, something in one of the steps needs to be a violation of what is expected, and that causes the surprise, and people then are more likely to remember that. So some examples of this are to create an aha moment. So when everything lines up and people say, aha, I understand. There's a loop where, and the loop is about when you add a different layer. So you tell a story and it's got information and it makes sense in its own right. And then a little bit further on you tell more information. Then you add another layer to the story. And then towards the end you sort of close the loop and create that aha moment. So there's a story that has information, then you put on another story, then you can bring the stories back together. You can put a hook in the story that pulls people towards the resolution that you want or the outcome that you want. Use a punchline. And as I said, the violation. This is the unexpected or the surprise. Your failure can be the story. That can be the violation. How you put everything in place, you did this and you did this, and the outcome was a disaster. And then you go back and you reveal what you failed to do in the process. And the lesson and the learning is not so much in that you failed or that you mucked up, in that you now recognize the essential step or the essential process that everyone needs to do if they want to resolve this solution you had overlooked, and then you call to your audience. So don't ever do what I did. These are the steps that you need to do to not have the negative outcome or the failure that I had as I tried to resolve this process. Failure can be your exception. The next section is around share your struggle. Some of the best stories, some of the best presenters, the most engaging trainers are people who have struggled in their own life or in their own business or in their own career and have been able to bring everything back on track. So my own story, and I mentioned I'm a public speaking trainer and coach, and my passion is around empowering and giving people the ability to speak up, to find their voice. My background is that I'm a person who stutters, and much of my life I was the odd person out. In high school, at university and at work, I did not contribute verbally. No matter how good my idea was, no matter how sure I had the solution to the problem, I would not contribute. I had to push through that, and now I do public speaking and training for my profession, for my full-time business. And people really find that amazing and powerful, that someone who stutters and was unable to speak has been able to succeed and do this for his living. So their own fear of public speaking shrinks a little bit. It diminishes because they now know that if someone else can do this, then they can also. So were you the odd one out? Were you the red ball in the room of balls? Were you treated differently? Did you succeed despite adversity? One of my keynote presentations is turning lemons into lemonade. So when life gives you a lemon or a stumbling block, do you turn it into lemonade or do you make it a building block? So your personal struggle is very powerful. It will be memorable, so the retention rate will be higher, but also it'll take people on an emotional journey and you'll inspire them to move forward. When you share your personal struggle, it's important that the message needs to relate to what the audience wants. My audiences want to learn to be better public speakers. So if I tell them about my personal struggle with something else, with asthma, with losing weight, in my public speaking workshops, that story, unless I can cleverly weave in a message that relates to public speaking, that story is not relevant. So your personal struggle in relation to what the audience needs and wants to take away from your presentation, that's very important. So thank you for that question. Another reason to tell stories, another aspect of stories that adds credibility to you as a speaker, is that your stories are your unique intellectual property. So what I mean by that is you own your stories. You did work on that difficult project. You did have that conflict that you had to manage and resolve. And when you use that story, should you be talking about problem solving, bringing a project that was going over budget over time, but you used innovative solutions, you thought outside the box to bring it back on track, even though you may have used traditional project management tools and strategies, that particular story is your unique intellectual property. If you work in human services and maybe you work with people with disabilities, physical disabilities or intellectual disabilities, and maybe you've worked with families that were in crisis because they had a child with a disability and it was becoming too much, and they didn't have enough time, they didn't have enough resources. And as a community services worker or a disability services worker, you were able to connect them with some resources, with some support. You were able to find another funding model that helped them just get by, and as a result, their whole outlook turned around. Now, while you would have to de-identify the details of that story, the process and the steps that you went through in a very difficult situation is your unique intellectual property. So when you use your stories, you are adding credibility. And also, no one can say, well, no, that's not true, that wouldn't work. We can't do that. That's a silly way. Well, hang on. Let me tell you again what I did. This project, XYZ, was going over budget and beyond time. I took steps of doing A and B, and then I brought in C, and as a result of that, project XYZ is now back on budget and back on time. But someone from the audience says, no, you can't do B. It won't work. Let me tell you again what happened with this project. And you go over it again. These are the steps I went through. This is the outcome that I got. And I want you to, and then you can encourage everybody to think about adopting your new strategy or your new way. It's your unique intellectual property. It adds credibility to what you're saying, and people can't dispute it and say, well, no, that won't happen. And I've just had a question typed in. Yes, some stories are fairly generic, and if you have a story of bringing a project back on track and you've used standard project management tools, and anyone else in the same situation who's good at project management would have done the same thing, then maybe that story does not have the same impact as a story where you've been a little bit innovative, a little bit different. But then if you were talking about project management and encouraging people to think differently or adopt a new way, you wouldn't just go through the same routine processes unless you were teaching project management at university. But if you're trying to deliver some new learning, then your story would have something innovative, something unique that maybe people hadn't thought of. That's where your stories are really powerful for creating a new learning environment. Okay, moving on. Now guys, I'm moving fairly quickly, so I'm going to finish a little bit early, I think. So with your permission, it is Friday afternoon. So another reason for using stories, they are your unique intellectual property. I mentioned framing stories. So framing stories is around about choosing the right story for the right audience. And I just mentioned project management, and choosing a generic copybook by the textbook story would not work with a group of experienced project managers. It would work with a group of students or people that were embarking on learning about project management for the first time. So this is where framing comes in. This is not a very good photograph, but it is a photograph of Cottesloe Beach here in Perth in Western Australia, for those of you who are in New South Wales and in Victoria. I'm going to reframe this photograph for different audiences. So if you think of this photograph as your story, or it could be your stories, and you're going to speak to different audiences. So I'm now going to reframe the photograph for an audience over east that might be coming over to West Australia, to Perth, and they want a unique dining experience. So I'm just going to grab, in the background is a restaurant called the Indiana Tea Rooms, and I'm going to bring that forward. So I've taken a subset, I've framed that overarching picture to suit a different audience. And I might say this is one of the most quirky places that you can dine in West Australia. And what you're going to see is you're going to see the wonderful sun set in the west going down over the Indian Ocean. Let's say I've got a different audience. Let's say that I now have a group of teenagers. It's a great bodyboarding beach. It's a great boogie board beach. It's not a good stand-up surfing beach, but it really is a good beach for young teenagers just to have a little bit of fun with the bodyboarding and the boogie boarding. Let's say I want to talk to parents. So I'm reframing the same material, but for different audiences. It's a good beach to play recreational sport, and it can be beach cricket, beach volleyball, beach soccer, depending on the crowds. So really nice pristine sand. So I've taken another subset. So an example of reframing material that I'll share with you is I talk about sometimes to give examples of using data and making data more concrete, more understandable for an audience. So rather than just giving numbers, how can the audience understand what you're saying? And I give an example of the human heart. So the human heart, which is about the size of the tennis ball, in an average lifetime pumps 350 million litres of blood. That's a lot of blood, 350 million litres. But probably those of you on the webinar and those who attend my workshops, you know, it's just a number, and they probably won't remember that number either, 350 million litres of blood. So I try to make the data more concrete, and I use two different ways of describing it for two different audiences. So I've done some work over in Bendigo for the water authority over there called Colaban Water. And what I say is 350 million litres of blood. What you need to do is go home tonight and turn on your kitchen tap and leave it running for 45 years. And that'll waste 350 million litres of water. They all say to me, no, you can't do that. That's wasting water. But they certainly now know how much 350 million litres of blood is. How much blood does the human heart pump? Well, if you turn on your kitchen tap, full bore, your kitchen faucet, if you're in America, turn it on full bore, leave it running for 45 years. That's 350 million litres of blood, or in this case, water. I'm now going to reframe that same information for the mining sector. So I do a bit of work for BHP, for Rio and for Chevron. 350 million litres of blood is what the human heart pumps. That's enough to fill 3 super tankers full of oil. I've framed the information for a different audience. So the mining and the oil sector may not remember 350 million litres of blood, but they've got a pretty good idea now that the human heart pumps enough to fill 3 super tankers full of oil. That's the concept of reframing. I'm going to pause for a moment. Okay, another example of reframing. Most of you out there at some time will apply for jobs. And in Australia, we use the term CV or curriculum vitae and the term resume. We almost use them interchangeably, but in fact, they're not the same. They are in fact different. So your curriculum vitae, your CV, is the curriculum of your life. Vitae means life, vital signs, vital organs. Curriculum vitae, your curriculum, so your entire life experience. Your resume is a subset of your CV. As I said, I know we use them interchangeably, but if you look at when you're applying for a job in one area, you will choose a subset of your CV and put that into your resume so it becomes targeted, or you reframe your work experience to meet that job. So as a teenager growing up in Denmark in the south of Western Australia, I used to work in sawmills. I used to spend my school holidays working in sawmills, shoveling sawdust, and on the saws docking logs to the right length. When I apply for a manager's job within the health department, I do not put into my resume that I used to work on a sawmill. It's not relevant. So I've reframed my life experience to meet the job that I'm applying for. So the stories that you tell new students, teenagers versus experienced people presenting at a national conference where you're going to have peers that know as much as you, if not more, different stories, different framing. When you have an audience of mixed people, then the reframing might become a little bit broader, and you might bring in little subsets in your stories framed for different audiences. So great question. So if you frame your stories in the right framework, it'll have more impact, it'll be more memorable. The wrong story to the wrong audience, no matter how powerful that story is, won't have the same impact. That's what I mean by framing. So thank you. The next point, build your bank of stories, build your library of stories. And in order to, you can sometimes reframe one story for different audiences, but another way of targeting those audiences is to have different stories. So collect your stories, collect your life experiences, and it can be beyond your own personal stories. I collect anecdotes, I collect cartoons, I collect quotes. I showed you some of those quotes earlier on. And I use different stories, different anecdotes, different quotes for different audiences. Stories are everywhere that you go. So I work with people a lot around the fear of public speaking, and my unique story helps me become credible and helps me help people in their journey of being more confident. A couple of stories or anecdotes that I've collected that I use are, and I'll share them with you. The first one is, and I mentioned in my opening remarks, public speaking is mankind's number one fear and dying is number two. And of course, Jerry Seinfeld made that famous comment, apparently you would rather be in a coffin than delivering the eulogy at someone's funeral. You'd rather be, if the fear of public speaking is higher than the fear of dying, apparently you would rather be in the coffin than delivering the eulogy. So I use that story just to, I guess, conceptualize that indeed the fear of public speaking is really high and a little bit bizarre and sometimes out of whack. So that's one anecdote that I've collected. Another story or another example of an anecdote that I've collected that helps me explain the role of fear in public speaking is that of Ringo Starr. I read in the Sunday Times a while back that Ringo Starr, the drummer of the Beatles, still experiences stage fright for every gig, for every concert he plays in. And it takes him 10 to 15 minutes before he starts to feel comfortable. But no way does that stage fright or that nerves or that anxiety, call it what you want, stop him from performing effectively. It's not until 10 to 15 minutes that he starts to relax and feel comfortable. So in public speaking, it's okay to have nerves. It's okay to have that before presentation fear or stage fright. Another story that I collect is a quote and an article that I read in the West Australian newspaper about Sally Pearson. So Sally Pearson won the gold medal at the London Olympics last year in the 110 metres hurdles for women. She was the only athlete who won gold medal for Australia. I'm not talking about the teams events. And when she was interviewed, and this is what I read in the newspaper, when she was interviewed before the gold medal final, she said, "Yes, of course I'm nervous. I'm glad that I'm nervous. If I did not have nerves, I would not be ready to race." Public speaking, presentations is a skill you learn. Some people say the sport of public speaking. So in other words, those three stories that I've collected, I've seen somewhere else, I roll them out as I need to share and engage my audience. So as you go through life, build your bank of stories, collect them, and then you'll have a wider framework, a wider range of issues that you can present to people. Different audiences need different stories. So that's what I mean by building your bank of stories. Moving on. So from your bank of stories, which is your signature story? Which is the story that carries your main message or your main influence or persuasion that people are going to walk away with? Do have a signature story. You don't need to use it all the time, but let's say you are put on the spot or you're asked to speak in your area of expertise with little notice. The ability to roll out that signature story has really great impact. So from your bank of stories or your library, which is your signature story? Great speakers, great presenters do develop that signature story. And as I said earlier on with the reframing, a good signature stories have several aspects that can be not bent's the wrong word, but can be shaped and modeled for a different audience. So I was talking about project management and how someone who was brilliant at project management and had a project that was going over budget, over time, and they used innovative techniques and out of the box lateral thinking to bring this project back on time and also back on budget. If you're presenting that story, if you're speaking to a group of university students, first year engineering university students that are taking project management, you would use the aspects of the story that followed the basic textbook steps that you would do in Project Management 101 to bring a project back on track. Let's say you're now speaking to a group of experienced project managers who, if they had a project that went slightly off the rails, they would use the same standard steps to bring it back on track. Then don't use that part of your story. Use the innovative part. Use the left field thinking part. Use the quirky part of your story that's not normal or not the normal way of bringing that project back on track. So with a signature story, it can have different shades of grey, different colours that you can then roll out and almost, as I said earlier on, almost frame that story to meet that specific audience. If you've got complex medical stories, then maybe you're talking about blood banking or sexually transmitted diseases to a group of high school kids. Maybe there's aspects of your signature story that you would leave out that you might include if you're presenting to a group of nursing staff. So develop your signature story. You know, that one that's guaranteed to create the emotion and have the impact every time. But be careful. I have seen a couple of speakers speak on multiple times and their signature story is all they've got. That's it. That's all they've got. I've just come back from the Netherlands in a town called Lunteren, and I attended the World Congress, the 2013 World Congress for people who stutter. I heard a speaker speak who I'd heard speak on 3 previous occasions in different parts of the world. It's a wonderful story. It's an inspiring story. I've now heard it 3 times, as have many of the other people in the audience. So just be aware of your signature story. And if you're able to, have multiple signature stories. I'm going to pause for a moment. We've had quite a few questions, so just see if there's any other questions. Type in the dialog box or raise your hand and I can open up your microphone. Okay. Just to help you take the concept of storytelling a little bit further, if you go to my website, which is just my name, so www.peterdew.com, in one of my blogs, and you can go to TED.com if you want it as well, www.ted.com, and look for the importance of connecting and building relationships. Look at Rita F. Pearson, Every Kid Needs a Champion. And this lady is an educator. She's a school teacher. And you should just watch her in this 6-minute TED video. You should watch her use story to create a wonderful case. And you'll remember this story. And I guess I can paraphrase it for you. I haven't watched it for a long time, but I don't want to spoil the video for you if you're going to go and watch it. But basically, one teacher, one of her colleagues said, I just teach, the kids don't have to like me. My job is not to be liked. And of course, her whole premise is that you need to connect, you need to build a relationship with your children in order for them to learn. Children do not learn from people they don't like. So that's just a practical real life example of someone telling a story that really has great impact. In fact, since then, I've put another TED video on my blog, and that's about a 12-year-old boy in Africa that invented a way of keeping the lions away from taking his family's stock. And he just tells the story, and he's a wonderful inventor, and it's the story that's memorable. So guys, stories are really powerful. Stories are really powerful. So that's the end of the webinar. Some of you have joined a little bit late. I am recording this webinar, so feel free to contact me, or you can go to my website and click on YouTube, and you'll find in a couple of days' time this webinar. When I say a couple of days' time, I mean probably Tuesday, Wednesday next week. You'll find this webinar recording available. Just a soft sell, if anyone's interested, on Monday we're running Assertive Communication Skills Workshop in Perth. Wednesday I'm running the Winning Presentation Skills in Perth. Thursday, Thinking and Speaking Off the Cuff, and Assertive Communication Skills in July in Sydney. Those of you who are from New South Wales, feel free to pass those dates on. And Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway, September 9th of September in Perth. There are other workshops in September that are on my website. My wife and I are going away for a while in August to visit my daughter who lives in London, so that's why between July and September you won't see any workshops, because we're away. Finally, are there any questions before we close the webinar? And I'm going to end 13 minutes early by the looks. Any last questions? Okay.